Understanding the cybersecurity landscape. Good morning, this is Dr. Pratham Datta. The cybersecurity landscape's been changing dramatically. If you ever remember an old movie, nice one too, with a young Matthew Broderick in it, it was a movie called War Games, where he is somebody who plays a networked version of some kind of an old arcade game and suddenly keys in some interesting network moves, and he realizes the old arcade game is nothing but a connection conduit to a big nuclear setup where you could now run an entire nuclear silo and start off a war game. Now, that was the time when people thought that, well, hacking and cyber warfare are tales told in movies and all these interesting books. But now, things have changed dramatically. From being a part of, we moved from being amateur hackers to cyber criminals, moved from a part of least resistance to being funded by billion-dollar corporations and nation states. Previously, hackers' the main job was trying to either impress or trying to gain some kind of notoriety by trying and hitting different sites if they found that that site was protected or there was an intrusion detection system, which is nothing but a series of systems like counter cyber intrusion systems that will try and detect if somebody is trying to access your network. And then the minute they would find that they're being detected, they would just leave and go. So they would follow a path of least resistance. But now, cyber criminals are no longer deterred by network defenses. You've got sophisticated breaches and intrusion regardless of corporation. They don't really care who the company is, who the person is. The idea is, if we can hold them hostage, if we can show them that this can be done, firstly, we can either steal their information, or the other new thing that started in the last couple of years is something called ransomware. And ransomware is nothing but the ability or the malicious behavior of groups and individuals where they try to access somebody's information, steal that information, and then hold it
area, and the ground is saturated
as ransom. So it's called ransomware. So I hold it as ransom till companies cough up some money. So here are some of the cases. Target, December 2013. The hackers actually didn't hit the main target database. They tried to access, and they ended up accessing, Target's information portal through the digital HVAC system, which is their air conditioning system. And which basically means Target's air conditioning system is controlled by some third party that can now say, all right, any kind of problems in your HVAC system, we can isolate that problem, any kind of call or repair schedules, they can manage that. What Target didn't do is hadn't segmented the network. So you try to segment networks such that if one part goes down, so that these are segments, you try to create these different segments. So if one part goes down, the other part isn't affected. Target hadn't segmented the networks, which meant that once they entered through the HVAC system, they realized that, hey, I can now access other databases within Target. So they entered the system, compromised on segmented point of sale systems. Point of sale systems are systems that you typically use when you're at the cashier or you're doing a self checkout and you're accessing what you're purchasing, getting your receipts, paying your money and everything. It's called a point of sale system. And they ended up stealing 70 million customer records. Sony Pictures, 2014. It was an intellectual property theft. This is something called spear phishing, where you try to not only do a phishing attack, where you're trying to mimic a different site and make it look like a legitimate site, mainly to steal customer information. So you could make your site look like, I don't know, Bank of America site, so that and lead somebody via an email to that site saying that, well, I think you misplaced your password, or somebody tried to access your account. Please click here to replace your ID and password. And you go in there and you put in your ID and password, but you're putting it into an illegitimate entity. So spear phishing is a very focused attack. This was an attack by cyber criminals. This is an interesting story, because what they first thought was there was a movie made by Sony Pictures highlighting Kim Jong Un and Kim Jong Il as really dodgy looking or dodgy tin pot dictators, and basically made fun of them. I think it had James Franco, somebody in it. I don't know if it was because of James Franco or not, but right after that, they had a massive attack on Sony Pictures. Everybody thought that it was North Korea that spearheaded the attack. It was only about 6 to 8 months later that they realized, no, these were cyber criminals in Russia and Ukraine who hit Sony Pictures. What they ended up doing was they ended up stealing a lot of movie material that Sony was planning on releasing, a lot of emails amongst Sony executives that were subtly divulged, making them feel embarrassed, but it also made Sony redo a lot of its movies and also change the release dates for its movies. In 2017, there was a ransomware called WannaCry. Now, WannaCry spread around the world. What it did was it ended up walloping hundreds of thousands of targets, loads of mainly public utilities and large corporations. So the idea was to hit a lot of public utilities who oftentimes will control things like water supply or gas supply. They can change different configurations, get different information. The biggest hit happened when the ransomware temporarily cripples the NHS, the National Health Service, which is the main universal healthcare service in the UK. The hospitals, and people suddenly realized that patient data wasn't available, and you couldn't, the pathological tests were missing and so forth. So this was a ransomware, which basically meant that right after they hit NHS, WannaCry, with this virus, they said, the people who started this thing said, give us some money or else you won't have access to your services. So you're having a new generation of terrorism and a new generation of ransom, very much like in the 1970s, 1990s, they had all these hijackings taking place all over the world. Now you're instead hijacking systems. Then in 2017, there's another one called Petya, which was a ransomware actually masked a targeted cyber attack against Ukraine. So this was a time when a lot of brouhaha was raging about Russia taking over, annexing parts of Ukraine, places like Donetsk, and heading towards Sevastopol, that Russia was claiming was originally Russian, and everybody was getting upset over it. So when Ukraine started protesting, what Russia did was it created a ransomware that hit the Ukrainian infrastructure particularly hard, disrupting utilities like power companies, airports, public transit, the central bank, in a later series of cyber assaults against the country, and basically crippled Ukraine in just a matter of days. You didn't need a standing army. You didn't need to fire a single volley. Instead, all you did was you created a ransomware, a virus, where you basically brought a country to, or the country's utilities to its knees. So malware moved from everything that was once a bit innocuous, mainly every time you downloaded something dodgy, it would pop up with free weather app in the sidebar of your computer, and you'd wonder, I'd never installed a weather bar, but who knows? But now it's become much more sophisticated. So, what is malware? So, malware is nothing but a malicious software or code that typically damages or disables, takes control of, or steals information from a computer system. So, malware is basically nothing but a tiny piece of software that's written and packaged with some other software that you download without knowing that you're downloading it, and it automatically runs, but its main function is damage, disable, take control, or steal information. And given the fact that we are always on a network, it'll automatically use your network to relay the information back to the site or back to its own HQ. So, malware broadly includes adware, which is giving you ads when you don't want those ads. So, they'll force some ads onto you. Backdoors, nothing but opening a computer door, which is nothing but a port that you didn't know of, through which attackers can link onto your computer and steal information. Bootkits. A boot for in a computer system, a boot is basically the startup sequence of a computer. So that's why it's called booting a machine. So a bootkit is something that installs so that anytime you start your computer, this malware is also activated. So as if you're running an application without knowing that you're running an application. Logic bombs. So a logic bomb is nothing but a piece of software which doesn't look like malware, but it creates a devastating impact on your entire system. I'll give you an example of a logic bomb. A logic bomb might say that if this certain database ID were to be removed, then delete the other database IDs. Now, if a system were to be checking in terms of whether this looks like suspicious code, it might say that no, these are normal things. Oftentimes, if you change one or delete one, you also end up deleting the others. This is a normal bit of code that's written. But in this case, it could have been a malware that's writing that code, that's written that code, rather than you. There was once a famous story where an employee, and this is again going back into separation of duties, you need to understand that you have to have your employees have roles where one role doesn't allow the employee to collude with the other roles he or she has. So this is a story where the same database engineer was also the software coder, which basically meant that one day he realized that he is likely to get the sack. So what he did was he wrote a small piece of software as a logic bomb that simply said, if my employee ID, whatever the employee ID might be, I suppose it was 123456. If 123456 were to be ever removed, change all these other database IDs, or delete some of them, or change them, or replace them with certain numbers. Which basically meant that if his ID were removed, which means he were terminated or given the sack, he would end up corrupting the entire database, and that's exactly what happened. So pay close attention to separation of duties. Any chance of collusion, you must try and nip in the bud. The next one is something called a rootkit. A rootkit is nothing but something that lives in your computer's base system, just like the way we talked about bootkits. A bootkit is when the computer is booting up. A rootkit is whenever something is set up that when one application opens or when the operating system starts, what starts with the operating system? And this malware will embed itself right at the rootkit of the whole set. A famous rootkit story was a problem with Sony once, where Sony had installed a rootkit so that people couldn't copy songs and videos on Sony DVDs and Sony CDs to other CDs. So they created a rootkit which basically meant that anytime you started a CD player, it would automatically start this anti-copying software would automatically start with it, but Sony installed that without the customer's notice, and it became a huge privacy issue. Later on we'll talk about privacy and cybersecurity, because that's a very, very important piece of the puzzle. We'll talk a little bit about law, privacy and cybersecurity, because that's very important for you to know as managers in the process. But right now, so that was a rootkit story. Spyware. Spyware is nothing but something that spies on your computer. So it's a type of malware whose main job is every time you type, for example, a spyware might be written in a way that activate only when you type the name of a bank website, such as www.usbank.com or www.chase.com. Only when you type something like that will the spyware activate, and it'll automatically try and capture all the information that you're sending. Trojan horses are things that look innocuous but actually hide some malicious code in it. So it could be a Trojan horse, could very well be a small piece of software that you add as an extension or download in order to convert something into a different type of video or to rip your DVDs into an MP4. But within that, there's something hidden that's trying to steal some kind of information. And the Trojan horse, of course, you know the very famous story of the Trojan horse. If you in the reading of the Iliad, where and the Greeks, after 10 years of fighting, left in Troy a large Trojan horse as a sign of final defeat, and left the shores and as a tribute. And the Trojans were elated, and they pulled the Trojan horse in, a large wooden structure of a horse, only not to realize that inside the belly of the Trojan horse were hidden all the famous fighters, including Achilles and Agamemnon and Odysseus and so forth. And they ended up burning Troy that same night. So they got out of the Trojan horse at night when everybody else was having some kind of revelry. The Trojans were having some kind of revelry, and they burned down the whole of Troy. Viruses. So viruses are nothing but software pieces of code whose main job is to get some kind of information and infect your system. A worm is different from a virus because a worm moves from one's type of application to another, to another, to another. One kind of document or file system to another, to another, to another. So it moves along with it. So that's malware. Spear phishing. So spear phishing, we talked about spear phishing with one of the targeted attacks. It's a targeted phishing campaign that appears more credible to its victims by gathering specific information about the target, and thus has a higher probability of success. So what spear phishing does, it's a type of phishing attack, but it's much more driven by psychology rather than by sheer probability. So a spear phishing email may spoof an organization, such as a financial institution or individual, such that the recipient actually knows and does business with, and may contain very specific information such as the recipient's first name rather than just an email address. So spear phishing could originate as such. Instead of just sending you a note saying that we feel that your Kent email account has been compromised. So all the attackers need to do is realize the people who are likely to fall prey to one of these phishing attacks might be anybody with at kent.edu domain. So as long as you send it to every single combination of user ID for kent.edu, so they'll start at, and they know that at Kent, the user IDs are typically might start at being four letters. So they'll start at A or B, A, and they'll create, or they'll automatically, they'll have systems that will generate every possible ID. Now, these IDs, not all of them are correct IDs, so a lot of them are never going to be delivered, but it also means that other IDs are going to hit somebody else. Now, when it hits them, if you find it from an unknown source, you might just delete it. However, or your spam folder might take care of it. However, if it says, if these attackers were to trace somebody in, I don't know, in the dean's office or one of the faculty or in the MBA office and specifically put their name onto it, saying, whoever it is, some person from the Department of Finance, and they assign the name of the person, is sending you the email. Your spam folder is less likely to spot it as spam and will think that it's a legitimate source because it appears to match others who might have sent you a similar email and will move it to your proper inbox, which is the first line of win for the for the hackers or the malware deliverers who are, or in this case, the phishing deliverers who are trying to get you or cajole you into clicking on that address. So do realize a lot of cybersecurity, the best cybersecurity, is driven by psychology at the front end, which works as confidence trickster, and then technology at the back end, rather than the other way around. So spear phishing and phishing attacks are not always conducted by email. A link is all that's required, such as a link on Facebook or on a message board or a shortened URL on Twitter. These methods are particularly effective in spear phishing because they allow the attacker to gather a great deal of information about the targets and then lure them into dangerous clicks in a place where the users feel comfortable. So you're trying to act like a confidence trickster. First gain confidence, then shower a volley of phishing attacks or spam attacks or malware attacks on the perpetrator. And oftentimes you'll see those as being the first line of cyber warfare, where they'll try to use a lot of, I don't know, pretty girls or certain interesting monetary benefits. It's weird. It's always pretty girls or monetary benefits that lure people into doing stupid things. Or possibly handsome guys too. But nonetheless, they'll try to they'll try to establish or take them into confidence first by reaching out through Facebook or through Twitter or through something else. And then once you feel, and these are people who are working you or working multiple people like you in the background with certain levels of probabilities, till you feel comfortable, and then they'll say, hey, by the way, if you want to see some more pictures, or if you want to know a little bit about where I live, or if you want to know a few things about the money that I want to send to you, information about that, click here. And you've clicked there and voila, or if you've downloaded a document, you really don't know what's in that document, what's in that picture, because the picture itself, that file itself, could be containing a lot of malware in the process. So targeted intrusions So an intrusion is a penetration attack on a system, trying to breach the system and trying to find a vulnerability or a weakness within a network. So advanced malware is a key component of targeted, sophisticated, and ongoing attacks. It can be customized to compromise specific high value systems in a target network. So, advanced malware is becoming a part of a very targeted, sophisticated, and ongoing attacks. And you can compromise high value systems in a target network. So, oftentimes, you'll try to create a sense of stealth in the process, but you will also want to turn it into a very sophisticated stealth. So the sophisticated bit would be either understanding the weakness in a system or the weakness in a person in a very strong system. So once again, I'll mention it. You're trying to find out weakness in a system, which is way more difficult than finding weakness in a person, even though the strong system might be prevalent. So, it's easier to find weakness in a person who's accessing a strong system rather than it is finding weaknesses in a strong system itself. So, perfect example again. Think of it. How easy is it for somebody to figure out what your password might be on your phone? Frankly speaking, if well, how many times do we even care about if somebody's eavesdropping when we're entering passwords on a phone? There are so many instances where, especially, there are some phones where you have to draw a pattern in lieu of a password, but that pattern sometimes is so obvious that the minute you draw it, even somebody from a few feet away could possibly gauge what that pattern is, which basically means that you could have the most secure phone in the world, but if your password is compromised, nothing really matters. Now, of course, you have things such as, we call it biometrics, where you're using thumbprints. But if somebody is truly a criminal, it could basically have forced somebody to put in their fingerprint just by holding a knife or a gun or whatever it is, or just coercing them into doing so. So it's oftentimes easier to access a person rather than. So advanced malware, although it's focused on creating a sophisticated set, the idea is, how do you deliver it? Do you deliver it through the person of least resistance or a system of least resistance? And they realize oftentimes it could be a person of least resistance as well as a systems of least resistance that could work. So here's a story: Carbanic, the Great Bank Robbery. Carbanic is one of the latest examples of a targeted attack that began in August 2013 and is currently still active. The attacker sent spear phishing emails with malicious CPL attachments or Word documents exploiting known vulnerabilities. Once inside the victim's network, money is extracted. Each raid has lasted 2 to 4 months. To date, the attackers have targeted up to 100 financial institutions, causing aggregated losses estimated at $1 billion. Perfect example of Carbanac is the spear phishing emails with malicious CPL attachments or Word documents that focus on the vulnerabilities not of the system but of the individual that is likely to download that and suddenly wreak havoc onto the system. Then, of course, you've got DOS, DDoS, and botnets. So DOS stands for denial of service, DDoS stands for distributed denial of service, and botnets is nothing but a network of bots. And bots are nothing but software pieces that are used as small modular pieces that can just roam around and create problems. So DOS and DDoS, these are denial of service attacks. These are one of the most prevalent attacks because they'll try to cripple your site so that nobody else can access your site, and anytime you try and access the site, it says site is unavailable. So you've got bots, which are nothing but individual infected endpoints. An endpoint is the final point, right? So these are things that hit a system, but they hit it in terms with a specific idea in mind, which is try and bring the system down. They're often used in distributed denial of service attacks, which basically means they're coming from many different points. So the way this happens is as follows. You try to lure many people. For example, a perfect example would be torrent sites. You say that, all right, so what's movie being released right now? Suppose Atomic Blonde. In Atomic Blonde, somebody's gone onto the movie theater and recorded it on some video camera and is now posting the first release with shoddy video and shoddy sound, but nonetheless you don't want to go to the movie theater and want to watch a free version of it, so you end up downloading it. So it's on a torrent site and many people around the world have downloaded it. Now as you've downloaded it, it might actually include a bit of malware whose main job is to create a denial of service attack. So now you've downloaded, that movie's been downloaded by possibly, 5,000 people around the world. 5,000 people have been infected, or their computers have been infected by that particular malware. This malware hides its identity and starts sending a stream of useless data. Suppose this malware's main job is to impact or bring down the Kent website. So this malware from 5,000 different places will start sending hundreds and thousands of false requests to Kent. Suppose saying, I want to access the bursar's office. Everybody saying, I want to access the bursar's office. Suppose each of these 5,000 malware is set up to send 1,000 queries each to the Kent State Bursar's office. So 1,000 from each of the 1,000, right? Now you've got basically millions of requests going to the Kent State Bursar office at any given point of time. And the Bursar's database is likely to be able to only accommodate just like a door or a window or like a cashier window. If there are 50 people at the cashier window, everybody else gets blocked. If there's one person with normal throughput, everybody gets access. So if you overwhelm the cashier window or overwhelm the door, nobody else gets access, and that's what they try and do. So to overwhelm a target server or network with traffic from a large number of bots. It usually takes an army of bots, known as botnets, to bring down a target network or server. The attacker leverages the massive scale of the botnet to generate traffic that overwhelms the network and server resources of the target. There's a very famous DDoS attack against GitHub. GitHub is very famous for hosting new innovative software. So GitHub, the largest public code repository in the world, experienced a massive distributed denial of service attack in March 2015. The attack appeared to originate from China and specifically targeted two GitHub projects designed to combat censorship in China, Greatfire and CN New York Times. So what GitHub was doing was GitHub had two interesting new software projects that people were contributing to help build it. So this is collaborative software building, also called open source software building, called Greatfire and CN New York Times. Its main job was to reduce censorship in China. So this software would try and break the censorship bit by creating other ways so that people in China could get information that the government was blocking. This DDoS attack was not from a person or from a group, but was from a country. So it was a state-sponsored attack against GitHub, and it basically tried to bring down GitHub, mainly the Great Fire and CN New York Times project websites. So it's a changing landscape that's dramatically shifting, where the players are becoming bigger, larger, and more sophisticated. The next thing to talk about is something called an APT. APT stands for Advanced Persistent Threats. So, an APT is something that's beyond malware and botnets together to create a multi-pronged attack, which basically means it's from many different ways to get a system down. It's called APT because it's advanced, persistent, and carries a threat. Why advanced? Advanced because it uses additional sophisticated equipment such as human intelligence and surveillance. Persistent because it runs over a long period with low and slow approach to avoid detection. Threat because it's focused towards creating real damage. So it doesn't just use technology, it uses a lot of human intelligence. So especially if you look at the military, they use three types of intelligence. One's called humans, comment, and SIGINT. So human is human intelligence, common is communications intelligence, like the data that you're sending through the network, and SIGINT stands for signals intelligence, which is the separate communications that you're sending along with the data, such as an email that carries certain information. That's a SIGINT. So you've got signals intelligence, you've got communications intelligence, you've got human intelligence. If you can combine all three together, you're suddenly able to craft something very good and something that allows you to better scout out what you need to access and achieve. So Stuxnet. But it's also persistent because it happens over a long period with a low and slow approach. There's no overwhelming of anything. It's not like a denial of service attack, but it's a slow set that works over time. Patience is one of the bits that it carries with an advanced persistent attack, where you're trying to be patient and gain the confidence of somebody before you, at the end of the day, get the attack ready. So we talked about Stuxnet, which is an APT worm. The worm initially infected endpoints running Microsoft Windows and then targeted programmable logic controllers, or PLCs, running Siemens Step 7 software. In addition to collecting information about Iran's nuclear program, the attack enabled its controllers to cause Iran's nuclear centrifuges to spin faster and tear themselves apart. Stuxnet is believed to have destroyed 20% of Iran's nuclear centrifuges. And the interesting thing is, Stuxnet, the virus, or the worm in this case, was not sent through a vulnerability into a system, but vulnerability through a person. Stuxnet worm was carried via a USB drive from the outside by employees into the nuclear facility, which basically means it must have been a picture or a video or something that somebody was enticed into downloading without knowing that it carried a deadly worm that, to a certain degree, did something. If you were to ask me, I thought it did something phenomenal and brought down or delayed Iran's nuclear ambitions considerably. So malware characteristics. It takes an average of 188 days from infection to detection of malware. It's called being in the wild with a very low catch rate. So think of it, 188 days, which basically means little bit longer, little bit over 6 months between infecting a machine and detecting the malware. 6 months for the malware to run in the wild with a very low catch rate, and therefore 6 months for the malware to actually wreak havoc on your system. So, a vulnerability is a bug or a flaw that exists in software and creates a security risk that may be exploited by an attacker, just like the Siemens 7 PLC, the programmable logic controller. The attacker crafts an exploit. So, an exploit is something that allows you to leverage something or use something in your favor that targets the vulnerable software, essentially fooling the vulnerable software into performing functions and running code of the attacker's choice. So you might tell the code to say that anytime you find this kind of information, send that, or anything that's in a certain document folder, send me those files. So this is a fundamental shift compared to early types of malware, which were more or less a swarm of independent agents simply infected and replicated themselves. Increasingly, advanced malware has become a centrally coordinated network application in a very real sense. So now, the new generation of malware works as a network set, everything working together, everything central, rather than something that just infects one, then infects another, and you're hoping that, well, in case it isn't caught. But no, now malware is turning into an APT, which is everything's being centrally coordinated and controlled. Other characteristics of malware: the distributed fault tolerant architecture. Architecture is the style at which they're built, right? So advanced malware takes full advantage of the resiliency built into the internet itself, which means that if one bit goes down, the other piece still stays active. So if one malware goes down, it'll find another place to infect and automatically take over that bit. Advanced malware can have multiple control servers distributed all over the world with multiple fallback options. So if one is detected, the other one goes active. That's detected, the other one goes active. And can also potentially leverage other infected endpoints as communication channels. So they can even change the communication channels. If you stop one communication channel, it'll automatically open up the other one. Functionality. So malware is also multifunctional. Updates from command and control servers. So a malware is set up as follows. You've got a command and control, also known as CNC, server that reaches out to many malware 1, malware 2, and so forth, all over the world, connected and reconnected and reconnected. So these constantly send messages over to the malware saying do this, do this, do this. That can also completely change the functionality of advanced malware. So it can even very much like sending an update, can send an update saying that now do this. Previously you were doing this, so it can send them a malware update. This multifunctional capability enables an attacker to use various endpoints strategically in order to accomplish specific desired tasks, such as stealing credit card numbers, sending spam containing other malware payloads. So it's called a payload because it carries something else with it, such as spyware, and installing ransomware for the purposes of extortion. So malware is changing in dramatic ways. It's becoming distributed, it's becoming functional, it's becoming extremely well coordinated. It's using different communication channels. It's also turning to be polymorphic. So polymorphic is nothing but a mechanism by which you can change itself. It's like being like Janus with multiple faces. You can change your face so that if you're caught, you change your face. It's, if you watch Game of Thrones, it's like being faceless. It's like turning into Arya, or the Faceless Man in Bravos, where if one is found, it changes itself completely. So changing a single character or bit of a file in source code completely changes the hash signature. A hash signature is very much like an ID card for a software. So polymorphism is used to avoid detection by hash-based anti-malware signatures. So what you do is, the way antivirus and anti-malware works is very much the way that they learned from how CDC creates antivirus or antiviral medicine. You try to first find the signature of a virus. This is the chemical composition. This is how it attaches itself to a protein or to a sort of DNA structure. And then, based on that, you'll create an antivirus mechanism that will say, anytime it bears these markers, which will identify um, this particular virus, stop it, or create an antivirus that will basically break down that protein connector. So it's the same story out here, where they'll try to create a signature for that malware. But the interesting thing is that with APT, advanced persistent threats, sophisticated malware can polymorph. It can change its identity to pass through the network even when it knows that its previous identity has been detected. So by regularly mutating to avoid simple hash signature matches. Finally, you have obfuscation, which is hiding or hiding in plain sight. There's some movie where they're talking about, if you really want to hide from the police, they were planning a heist or something like that, and they set up their heist headquarters right across from the police station, that this is the last place that they're likely to look for. So advanced malware often uses common obfuscation techniques to hide certain binary strings that are characteristically used in malware and therefore detected by anti-malware signatures to hide an entire malware program. So they're hiding their identity and they're hiding the location and the style by changing the style at which malware even operates. So your obfuscating is hiding or creating a mechanism by which you're hiding yourself. Now let's get into cyber criminals. So cyber criminals are this new generation of people who are realizing you can actually make money from cybercrime. That the internet is murky waters, and in murky international waters, very much like these Somali pirates, they operate in international waters, which basically means that they can roam in wild abandon and go around hijacking things. That's exactly what these cyber criminals are doing. However, they're using the facade of a legitimate business. They're being sponsored by large corporations, motivated by financial or strategic gain, have far more resources available to facilitate an attack, with greater technical depth and focus, are very well funded, and are much better organized. There are various cyber attack strategies. The first one is something called reconnaissance. Now, reconnaissance, very much like common criminals, cyber criminals will carefully study their victims and plan their attacks. Use social engineering. Now, social engineering is a mechanism by which you use people's emotion and psychology and sense of distress to socially engineer them and therefore turn into a confidence trickster and bring them in your confidence before you hand them over some kind of a malware or something, or practice some kind of cyber attack strategy. Phishing, email address harvesting, which is just the way we're talking about. You can create all these different email addresses, find email addresses, and other tactics to research, identify, and select targets. The second one is weaponization and delivering. Once you've found your right target, once you've brought them in your confidence, the next idea is, how do you create the right weapon for them and how do you deliver it? Next, the attacker determines the malware payload and the method that will be used to deliver it. For example, data files or web pages can be weaponized with exploits that can be used to target the victim's vulnerable software and delivered via an email attachment or drive-by download. So, oftentimes, once you know who your target is, and the thing is, what would be the best way to deliver a malware or a cyber threat or access the vulnerability of the target itself? So something called drive-by download is getting very popular because it delivers advanced malware by an exploit in the background without the user's knowledge. So drive-by download is something very similar to visit this web page, and it's a web page crafted just for the victim or the type of victim. So it's an entire category of victims, and anytime they visit that web page, automatically in the background a software is downloaded, which is basically a malware. It's called a drive-by download. So as you're driving by, like as you're browsing through a website or a page or a file, something else is being downloaded in the background without your knowledge. Other cyber attack strategies are exploitation. Now, the attacker has two options for exploitation. The first one is social engineering, which is a relatively simple technique, like we talked about, used to lure someone into clicking a bad link or opening a malicious executable file, for example. An executable file is a file that basically installs something. And a bad link will take you to some place, but you have to be in a position to make sure that they will do it. So it's a type of exploitation. And then you've got software exploits, which is the technical part, which is a more sophisticated technique because they essentially trick the operating system, web browser, or third-party software into running an attacker's code. Now, software exploits are way more difficult because it's easier to patch or upgrade and fix a software with known vulnerabilities so that they don't feel like they, oftentimes that's what we called a zero-day attack. When a software is first released, you try to use that software against itself to find problems within that software code and deliver some kind of a vulnerability, and you use this vulnerability to deliver some kind of a malware. However, software can quickly learn to look for these problems, and you can send a new patch or a new upgrade or a new fix, and suddenly you've got some kind of control over the threat. However, human beings, we're still running centuries old, possibly millennia old software in our own brains. We're still prone to emotions, to distress, to depression, to the sense of tension, to sense of malady. And it's easier to lure us into the trap. So typically social engineering is, especially for very sophisticated attacks, social engineering is the first piece of the puzzle. Next is installation. Once the target endpoint has been infiltrated, the attacker needs to ensure persistence, resilience, or survivability, which means finds a way to deliver the software so that make sure that the software stays and the malware stays, and allows the malware to constantly communicate and give you information over time. Remember, it's persistent, so you want information collected over time, not just once. So one option, rootkits, are malware that provide privileged root level access to a computer. So root level access is right when the computer starts. Bootkits are kernel mode variants of rootkits, commonly used to attack computers that are protected by full disk encryption. So bootkits is the first line, as we talked about, when a computer boots. Even before your encryption boots, this malware will try to be active so that before you can even encrypt things and hide them, it can actually find that information and send it back. Backdoors enable an attacker to bypass normal authentication procedures to gain access to a compromised system, and often installed as a failover in case other malware is detected and removed from the system. So you'll create these backdoors so that it's like a backup. That's what a failover is. It's a backup. if your malware is detected, what it does is it still opens another line of malware communication so that you can communicate. Now, they can also install antivirus software to disable any legitimately installed antivirus software on the compromised endpoint. So you're trying to break the antivirus system that's already in play by creating an antivirus software so that the antivirus software that you have, it doesn't work any longer. So once you found your target and you found the best way of delivering it and you know exactly how to exploit it, then you find the way to install it, and you can install it as a rootkit, as a bootkit, as a backdoor, or as anti-AV software, among others. So with cyber attack strategies, the main idea, now that you've installed everything, the APT, you want to create a command and control. So this allows you, or is called CNC, communicate with infected systems to enable command and control and to extract stolen data from a target system or network. Also can be used by the attacker to move laterally, which is move across the system, targeting other systems on the victim's network. So once they find your network system and you're connected, your phone's connected to your computer and your computer's connected to the other computer and your other computer's connected to your Plex server or to your television system, they'll try to find vulnerabilities into all of them and move laterally across the system. As long as things are on your network, it'll move across the network itself. So oftentimes you'll find that they'll even try to use sophisticated things, just the way we talked about HTTPS. They're even using malware with an HTTPS coding. So they're encrypting malware with SSL or SSH, so that the proprietary encryption is that's commonly used. Even then, it'll basically be an encrypted malware that's being downloaded onto your system. So if the malware is sending information that your computer's antivirus system or your firewalls would have otherwise detected, now it can't detect it. So they're using SSL against you in the process. So BitTorrent is known for use of proprietary encryption, both for infection and command and control. Circumvention via proxies, remote desktop access tools such as LogMeIn, RDP, go to my PC. So they'll use all these proxies. A proxy is nothing but a mechanism to hide the identity of where the address is from. And they're using these ways to circumvent the ability of from finding firewalls and so forth, finding different ways by which they're communicating. Port evasion using network anonymizers or port hopping to tunnel over open and non-standard ports. So if oftentimes your system, your firewalls and so forth will try to protect you by closing certain ports, what a lot of these command and control malware, advanced malware, will do is they'll try to evade the port. So if that port doesn't work, use another one that you didn't expect it to be using to basically communicate. And then fast flux or dynamic DNS, DNS stands for domain naming system, to proxy through multiple infected hosts, reroute traffic and make it extremely difficult for forensic team to figure out where traffic is going. So they also try to hide where it's going to. So DNS will allow you to figure out exactly where it's going, but they'll try to reroute the traffic in such a way so that you'll never know where this information is heading, which basically means that you really sometimes don't know who the real perpetrator is. So finally, cyber attack strategies have actions on the objective. Attackers have many different motives for attack, including data theft, destruction of critical infrastructure, that's why it's become a national priority right now, hacktivism, or cyber terrorism. That's why most governments are realizing that cyber attacks can really cripple their entire country because we are so digitally connected, and it's become one of the biggest sources of attacks. Way more important than something like having military tanks or air force. It's a new generation of warfare. This final phase of the attack often lasts months or even years, particularly when the objective is data theft, as the attacker uses a low and slow attack strategy to avoid detection. The idea is get in, stay there for a very long time, and make sure that all the data is collected or the systems are impaired slowly over time to avoid detection. So, cybersecurity lessons. Firstly, communication is the lifeblood of an attack. If you can stop the threat from communicating, you really have been able to protect yourself, because if the threat can't communicate, the attack can be neutralized. Second, numerous opportunities exist to detect and correlate. By virtue of the fact that multiple steps are involved in the advanced attack lifecycle, the one we talked about, there are multiple chances to identify and counter threats. So don't just focus on infection. Focus on everything from social engineering to how it communicates. That way you know that there are multiple different areas where you can nip it in the bud. The framework rather than the functionality is a threat. So do realize it's not what the malware does, but how a malware operates. We talked about the fact that processes are important. If you understand the process of the malware, you've taken care of the malware. See the threat as an extensible framework, not simply the functionality of the specific payload. So don't worry about where that malware just wants to steal some information. Understand the process by which it tries to steal the information. If you can understand the process, you can rectify the whole system, right? Just the way that if a company were to change the way it communicates with, it follows the entire communication policy with its employees, it can make the whole company better, versus looking at just one employee's miscommunication with somebody else and trying to rectify that. The problem lies in the process. If you can find the process, you found the problem, and you can take care of the problem altogether. Understand that threats exist across multiple disciplines and so much security. Firewalls, whose main job is to create a wall between the outside and your system. Intrusion prevention, making sure that you've got the proper antivirus and encryption and everything playing a role in it so that you can prevent any kind of intrusion. Advanced endpoint protection, what you're using, you have to ensure that it's properly protected. Content filtering, you know that what is coming into your computer are legitimate things, so don't download things, don't access things that you shouldn't be accessing. Don't go in for convenience, because convenience comes at a cost. These security solutions have traditionally been separated to provide defense in depth. This is called defense in depth, a very important term. But this strategy makes it difficult, if not impossible, to identify, correlate, and counter complex coordinated attacks that take advantage of multiple attack vendors. So all of these things once upon a time used to be single, standalone things. Have a firewall, have separate intrusion prevention, but unless one learns to talk to the other, you never know what the problem is. So all they're saying is that defense in depth requires all these different mechanisms to reduce the threat to also communicate between each other. Or else, you'll always go for the weakest link in the system. So if attacks are coordinated, your systems, your anti-attack or anti-intrusion systems should be coordinated too. So you must focus on all these different attack vectors, including applications, URLs, and websites. They can host and enable threats. Exploits, they can create command line or shell access to targets with escalated privileges. Malware, which is controls and uses the compromised targets, and then files used to update the malware and steal data. Do understand the security must expand beyond the perimeter to include network, endpoint, and cloud environments. You can have the best security in your phone, but if you're using an unsecure network, your phone's compromised. if you can have the best security in the system. However, if you use a device, or in this case an endpoint, which is also an endpoint, which itself is not the most secure device, you've compromised your system. So you must look at a secure network, secure devices or endpoints, and the secure internet through which you're communicating across the channels. Thank you very much, guys.